The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through old rope. Number 14 Prosper Street, Victorian residence, approximately 4,000 square feet. 3 stories plus a tower. Condemned by the county in 1991. No water, no electric, no gas. The roof has not been inspected in 15 years. The foundation has not been certified. Starting bid is $12. She paused, looking up over her reading glasses. $12, ladies and gentlemen, for a house. A man in the third row turned around in his folding chair and grinned at the room. His teeth were yellow from coffee and decades of Marlboros. That's the haunted house, Janice. The room laughed. A few men shook their heads. A woman in the back coughed into her sleeve. Someone else muttered something about pity, and someone else said something about good lumber going to waste. The auctioneer waited. She had done this enough times to know exactly what was coming. She picked up her pen to mark the property unsold. A hand went up in the back row. The room went silent, not gradually, all at once, like someone had closed a heavy door. The hand belonged to a man with white hair cut close to his scalp and eyes the color of November. His knuckles were thick and weathered. The skin on the back of his hand showed every one of his 74 years, and 42 of them spent holding a level of tape measure, a structural blueprint, a pencil sharpened with a pocket knife. The hand did not tremble. It rose plainly the way a man raises his hand when he means it. Beside him sat a woman of 71. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her knuckles were swollen at every joint, the fingers slightly bent, the way arthritis bends them when it has been working on a person for a decade and a half. She wore a thin gold wedding band on her left hand. Her right hand rested on top of his thigh lightly like a question she had been asking for 51 years and never tired of. $12. His voice was low and steady, not loud, not asking permission. The auctioneer took her glasses off. She put them back on. She looked down at her clipboard, then back at the man. Sir, do you understand this property has been condemned for 33 years? Do you understand the third floor was sealed by the previous owner and has not been opened since 1959? Do you understand there is no certification on the foundation, no inspection on the roof, no warranty of habitability? I am a licensed structural engineer in the state of Ohio, the man said. I've been in practice 42 years. I know what I'm buying. The room stayed quiet. The auctioneer waited another 10 seconds, long enough for someone to challenge the bid. Nobody did. Most of them looked at the floor. One man in a brown jacket looked at the back of the old man's neck and then turned away. $12 to the gentleman in the back. The man stood up. His knees made a small popping sound. His wife rose with him, her right hand sliding off his thigh and finding his elbow. And the two of them walked down the aisle together, past 30 people who would not meet their eyes. He laid 12 crumpled dollar bills on the table. The auctioneer counted them. 3 5s, 2 1s, 1 5 again because she had miscounted. $12. She handed him a single brass key on a plain metal ring. Good luck. She did not sound like she meant it. Outside the courthouse, the October air smelled like wood smoke and burnt leaves. The man stood on the steps with the key in his palm. His wife stood next to him a little closer than she usually stood, the way a woman stands when she is not sure whether the next thing that happens will hold her up or knock her down. The man closed his fingers around the key. 60 years. A plastered wall on the third floor of a house nobody had wanted. And what this old engineer was about to find behind that wall would shake every soul in this dying Ohio town to the bone. 2 weeks earlier, Linden Drive ran east to west through a quiet block of Columbus, Ohio. The houses on Linden Drive were not fancy. They were ranch-style places built in the early 1980s with brick fronts and aluminum siding on the back, and most of them had two-car garages and a basketball hoop nailed somewhere it shouldn't be. The Whitfield house sat at the end of the street. White siding, black shutters, a magnolia tree in the front yard that had been planted by Calvin Whitfield in the spring of 1983, when the magnolia was a sapling, and his oldest son was 3 years old, and the world still felt like a thing a man could shape with his hands. Now the magnolia was 41 years old and 17 feet tall, and there was a sign in the front yard, "For sale, sold." Calvin Whitfield stood at the kitchen sink. He was holding a coffee mug that said, "World's Best Grandpa," in faded red letters. The mug had been a gift from his 3 grandchildren when his youngest was 4 years old. She was 19 now. She had not called him since Christmas the year before. He turned the mug in his hand and read the letters, and then turned it again and read them again. Through the kitchen window, he could see his oldest son, Sterling, taping the sold banner across the front of the "For Sale" sign. Sterling was 47 years old. He was a financial advisor in Cleveland. He wore a dark gray suit because he had come straight from the office and he had not taken off his tie. Even though it was a Saturday morning and his parents were inside packing the last 42 years of their lives into 2 suitcases in the trunk of a 2014 Buick LeSabre, Sterling was on his phone. He had been on his phone for the entire 2 weeks since the sale had been arranged. Calvin had counted sometimes in the moments when there was nothing else to count. The number of minutes his oldest son could maintain eye contact during a conversation. The record was 40 seconds, and that was on Christmas morning 2 years ago, and Sterling had been talking about his portfolio. Calvin set the mug down on the counter. He went to the basement. He told his wife he was going to check the water shutoff valve. Adelaide did not respond. She was upstairs in their bedroom, folding a wool sweater into a suitcase that already had 3 wool sweaters in it, because she could not remember whether she had packed any wool sweaters yet. Calvin walked down the basement stairs slowly. The 3rd step from the top had creaked since 1987 when he had repaired it after his middle child had fallen through it. He had repaired it well. The creak was not a structural issue. The creak was a piece of memory the wood had decided to keep. At the bottom of the stairs was Calvin's workbench. He had built it in 1985 from oak he had pulled out of a barn in southern Ohio. The barn had been built in 1908, and the oak was over 100 years old when Calvin sawed it into the legs of his bench. The bench was now 39 years old. It would outlast him. He had always known that. He had been comfortable with it. Calvin put both his hands flat on the workbench. He closed his eyes. He stood there for 20 minutes. He did not move. He did not make a sound. The basement was quiet around him. The furnace clicked on and clicked off. The freezer hummed in the corner. Above his head, somewhere in the kitchen, he could hear Sterling's voice talking on the phone about a man named Bryce who had apparently said something about a portfolio. Calvin did not cry. He did not cry the way men of his generation did not cry. The water did not come out. But something else happened, something that happens to a man who has held a level true for 42 years and has just been told the level he held was the wrong one. Something inside his chest tilted slowly, the way a bubble drifts off center in a glass tube. He felt it shift. He felt it find a new resting place. He did not like the new resting place. When he came back upstairs, no one knew he had been gone. Sterling was standing in the kitchen now, drinking a glass of water. He had taken off his suit jacket. The jacket was draped over the back of a kitchen chair, the same chair Calvin's father had sat in on Thanksgiving in 1986, the year before he died. "Dad," Sterling said. He did not look up from his phone. "The buyer closes Friday. Movers come Wednesday. The piano goes with the rest of the furniture. We talked about this." Calvin did not answer right away. He walked over to the coffee pot. He poured himself a cup he did not want. He took a sip. The coffee had been sitting on the warmer for 2 hours, and it tasted like dust. "Your mother's piano," Calvin said. His voice was even. "She's had it 31 years, and the buyer doesn't want it." Sterling finally looked up from his phone. He had his mother's eyes gray-blue, the same shape. He had Calvin's jaw. He did not look like either of them when he was talking about money. "Dad, the equity in this house is the only retirement plan you and Mom have. Split 3 ways, it gives each of us enough to manage things." Calvin set his coffee cup down very gently on the counter. "Each of us. Not you and Mom and each of us, just each of us." He had heard it. He had heard it in the way you hear a hairline crack in a load-bearing beam. The sound was small. The implication was the entire structure. "And what about your mother and me?" Calvin said. It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence a man says when he wants to know if the person he raised understands what he just said. Sterling did not look up again. He was already typing into his phone. "There's a list. I had Bryce's assistant compile it. Subsidized senior housing in the Columbus area. Most of them have wait lists, but a few have openings within 12 to 18 months. We can put you up at a hotel in the meantime, or you could stay with Marigold for a while." "Marigold has 4 empty bedrooms," Calvin said. "Right. So she's got space." Sterling's phone buzzed. He looked at it. He smiled at whatever was on the screen. He looked back up at his father, but only halfway. Only to the level of Calvin's chest. Sterling could not look his father in the eyes anymore. He had not been able to for almost a year. Calvin had noticed. Adelaide had noticed. Neither of them had said anything to each other about it because saying it out loud would have made it true, and the version of the world where it was not yet true had been a slightly more bearable version to live in. "I gotta take this," Sterling said. He walked out of the kitchen onto the back patio with the phone pressed to his ear. Calvin stood at the counter for a long moment. He picked up the world's best grandpa mug. He looked at it. He set it back down. He left it on the counter when he walked away. That afternoon, Adelaide came down the stairs holding her jewelry box. The jewelry box was small. Walnut. Calvin had made it for her on their 10th anniversary in 1983. The hinges were brass. The interior was lined with deep blue velvet. He had carved her initials into the underside of the lid, where only she would see them. Adelaide walked into the kitchen and set the jewelry box on the table. She opened it. She lifted out the top tray. She looked underneath the top tray. She closed the lid. She opened it again. She lifted out the top tray again. She put the top tray back. She closed the lid. Calvin. Her voice was very small. He came in from the living room. "It's not here," she said. "My mother's wedding ring, it's not here." Calvin came over and looked at the box. He lifted the top tray himself, the way people do when they want a thing to be true so badly they will check it themselves, even though their wife has already checked it 3 times. The ring was not there. It had been there 2 days ago. Adelaide remembered because she had looked at it on Thursday morning. She had taken it out of the box and held it in her palm, the small gold band that her mother had worn for 53 years before she died. The only thing in this entire house that Adelaide cared about more than the piano. It was not there now. Calvin closed the box. Adelaide sat down at the kitchen table. She did not cry. Adelaide had not cried very much in the last 2 weeks. There had been a lot of things to cry about, and Adelaide had a finite supply of crying in her, and she was rationing it. "Where do you think it went?" Calvin said. Adelaide did not answer. She was looking out the kitchen window. Out the kitchen window on the back patio, Sterling was still on the phone. He was laughing about something. His tie was loose now. His suit jacket was still draped over the kitchen chair. From the back in the autumn light with his hair. The way it was, he looked exactly like he had looked when he was 16 and came home an hour after curfew, with a story about a flat tire that nobody believed. Adelaide did not say what she was thinking. Calvin did not say what he was thinking either. Some things in a long marriage do not need to be said out loud. Some things both of you understand at the same moment, and saying them would be a kind of cheapening of the understanding. Calvin walked over to the table. He put his hand on Adelaide's shoulder. He did not say it will be all right. He had stopped saying that to her 2 weeks ago. She had asked him to. Saturday morning, October the 19th, the Buick was packed. The trunk held 2 suitcases, a box of photographs, 3 books Adelaide had refused to leave behind Calvin's toolkit, and a small wooden box that contained Adelaide's wedding ring, and the gold pocket watch that had belonged to Calvin's father. The back seat held a duffel bag with 3 changes of clothes for each of them, a thermos and Adelaide's coat. Calvin counted the cash in his wallet at the kitchen table for the 3rd time. $340. He folded the bills and put them back in his wallet, and put the wallet in his back pocket. Adelaide was sitting on the front porch step with the door of the house open behind her. She was looking at the magnolia tree. The tree was 41 years old. It had been planted on the day Sterling came home from kindergarten, with a paper cutout of a magnolia leaf he had colored green and brown. Calvin had gone to the nursery that weekend and bought a sapling. Sterling pulled into the driveway in his Audi. He got out. He walked up the front walk. He stopped on the bottom step. "Mom." Adelaide looked at him. "I came to say goodbye." Adelaide did not answer. Sterling stood there for a moment. He shifted his weight. He looked at his mother, then at his father in the doorway behind her, then back at his mother. Marigold said the timing isn't good, Sterling said. She's swamped at work. Royce isn't answering anyone's calls right now. I think he might have gotten a new number. So you guys are gonna have to figure something out for the next couple of weeks. The hotel I mentioned, or goodbye Sterling, Adelaide said. She said it the way she had said it when he had been 5 years old, and standing at the door of his kindergarten classroom on the first day of school. The same gentleness, the same finality, as if she were releasing him into something neither of them could fully see. Sterling stood on the bottom step. He did not say anything for almost 10 seconds. Then he turned around and walked back to his Audi, and he got in and he backed out of the driveway, and he drove away down Linden Drive, and he did not look in the rearview mirror. Calvin closed the front door of the house for the last time. He locked it. He put the key under the mat the way the realtor had asked him to. He took Adelaide's elbow and walked her down the front walk to the Buick, and he opened the passenger door for her, and he closed it gently after she got in, and he walked around to the driver's side and got in himself, and he sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, looking at the magnolia tree. "Where do we go?" Adelaide said. Calvin turned the key in the ignition. East. He didn't know why he said east. There was nothing east of them that he knew of. But west was Cleveland, where Sterling lived, and north was the long highway up to the lake, and somewhere out there was Marigold with her 4 empty bedrooms and her bad timing, and somewhere even further out there was Royce with his new phone number that nobody had. So east it was. The first hour out of Columbus, neither of them spoke. Calvin drove. His hands stayed at 10 and 2 on the wheel the way they had stayed at 10 and 2 for 50 years. The Buick was a 2014 model with 140,000 miles on it. The transmission was good. The brakes had been replaced 2 years ago. The radio worked, but Calvin did not turn it on. He did not want music. He did not want voices. He wanted the sound of the road under the tires and the sound of his wife breathing in the seat next to him. And that was all the sound he wanted. The country flattened out as they drove. Cornfields, soybean fields, small farmhouses set back from the road behind dirt drives, a grain elevator rising up against the gray October sky, a tractor moving slowly across a brown field kicking up dust. Calvin watched it all the way. A man watches a thing he has lived next to for 74 years and has only now started to see clearly. Adelaide's hands were folded in her lap. Her knuckles were swollen. The arthritis had been getting worse over the last 6 months, although she had not told Calvin that. He knew anyway. He had watched her stop reaching for the high cabinet last spring. He had watched her start opening jars by holding the jar between her knees and twisting the lid with her right hand, because her left could not grip anymore. He had watched her, and he had said nothing because saying something would have shamed her. And Calvin Whitfield had never in 51 years of marriage shamed his wife. After 3 hours, Calvin needed to stop for gas. The needle was almost on E. He took the next exit. The exit dropped them onto a 2-lane county road that ran through flat farmland and old fence lines, and after 20 miles of that road, they came over a small rise and saw a town in the distance. The town had a green sign on the side of the road. "Welcome to Brixton, Ohio. Population 2,000. The sign looked like it had not been updated in a long time. The 2,000 had a small streak of rust running down through it. as if the actual number had been smaller for some time, and the town had simply decided not to acknowledge it. Calvin drove down what turned out to be the main street of Brixton. There was a hardware store on the left side. There was a post office on the right. There was a Baptist church with a tall white steeple at the far end of the street. Half the storefronts were empty. The other half had hand-painted signs in the windows. A barber shop, a small grocery, a diner with a faded red awning and white block letters that said, Rosie's Diner. Calvin pulled into a parking spot in front of the diner. Adelaide did not move. "I need to use the restroom," she said, "and I need to sit down somewhere that isn't this car." "Then we'll sit down," Calvin said. The bell above the door rang when they walked in. The diner had 8 tables and a counter with 7 stools. 6 of the tables were empty. The 7th had 2 old farmers in it drinking coffee. One of them looked up. The other one didn't. Behind the counter, a woman was holding 2 coffee pots. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck and her hair pulled back in a low ponytail, going gray at the temples. She was about 60 years old. Her apron said Rose in stitched cursive on the chest pocket. She looked at Calvin and Adelaide for a long moment. She did not look at them the way most strangers looked at strangers. She looked at them the way a person who has watched the world go past their counter for 30 years looks at the ones who carry something in with them. She did not ask any questions. She put the coffee pots down on the burner. "Sit anywhere you like," she said. "Booth by the windows got the most light." Adelaide went to the restroom. Calvin slid into the booth. The woman came over with 2 mugs and a coffee pot and a small pitcher of cream. She set them down without asking what he wanted. She poured him a cup. "First-timers eat free," she said. Calvin looked at her. "Is that a real policy?" "It is now." She set down 2 laminated menus and walked back behind the counter. Adelaide came out of the restroom. She slid into the booth across from him. She picked up her coffee mug with both hands, the way she did when her wrists were aching, and she held it and let the warmth go into her fingers. The restroom was at the back of the diner. On the wall next to the restroom door was a small bulletin board. While Adelaide had been in the restroom, Calvin had walked over to it. He had read what was on it. He had written something down on the back of his gas station receipt. Now he slid the receipt across the table to Adelaide. She picked it up. Cardwell County Tax Auction. The receipt said, in his small, careful engineer's handwriting, Saturday, 10 a.m. County Courthouse. 13 properties. And under that 14 Prosper Street. Victorian. Condemned. Starting bid, $12. Adelaide read it. She read it again. She set the receipt down on the table. $12, she said. $12. The woman in the apron came back to the table with a slice of blueberry pie on a small plate. She set it in front of Adelaide. Adelaide had not asked for pie. The woman did not explain. She walked back behind the counter. Adelaide looked at the pie. She looked at Calvin. "That's the Bellinger place." The woman set it from behind the counter without turning around, while she rinsed a coffee mug in the sink. 14 Prosper. Been empty since old Clara died in '83. Calvin looked at her. "That long?" 60 years, give or take. Kids around here call it haunted. Every old house makes noises. People hear what they want to hear. "Is it haunted?" Calvin asked. The woman finally turned around. She dried her hands on a dish towel. "Mister, in my experience, the only houses that are really haunted are the ones nobody loved enough. That house up on Prosper, somebody loved it once. Whatever's in there now is just waiting for somebody to love it again." She paused. "I'm Rose, by the way. Rose Hartwell. I own this place." Calvin Whitfield. "Adelaide." Rose Hartwell nodded. Adelaide looked down at the slice of blueberry pie. She picked up her fork. She took a small bite. She set the fork down. "Calvin," she said. She did not look at him. She looked at her hands folded around the coffee mug, the swollen knuckles, the wedding band of 51 years. "We don't have anywhere else to go." Calvin looked at her for a long moment. "I know." He said it the way a man says it when he has known it for 2 weeks, but has not been able to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would have meant admitting it was true. And admitting it was true would have broken something in him that he was not yet ready to have broken. But he was ready now. "I know, Addie." The next morning, the courthouse was cold. Calvin and Adelaide sat in the back row in folding chairs that smelled faintly of varnish. There were about 30 people in the room. Most of them were men in jackets and work boots. A few were realtors in cheap suits. One couple in their 30s looked like they had come to bid on a starter property and were realizing the starter properties were all worse than they had hoped. In the front row sat a man Calvin noticed immediately. He was about 44. Dark gray suit, black hair cut close on the sides, a Rolex on his left wrist. He sat very still the way a man sits when he expects to get what he came for. Beside him sat a thin man in his early 50s with rimless glasses and a leather portfolio. 2 young assistants sat in the row behind them, both staring at iPads. The man in the dark gray suit was Frank Donovan. Calvin did not know that yet. The auction started. The first lot went for $15. The second went for $30. A young couple bought a half-acre near the creek for $200. A landlord from 2 towns over picked up a pair of small houses for $800 each. The auctioneer came to the bottom of her list. Number 14 Prosper Street. She read the description in the same flat voice she had used for everything else. Calvin watched the man in the front row. The man in the front row gave a very small nod to the auctioneer. The auctioneer noticed it. She kept her face neutral. Starting bid is $12. The man in the front row started to raise his hand. Calvin raised his first. $12. The room went quiet. The man in the front row turned around in his seat slowly. The way a man turns around when he has just heard a sound he was not expecting and does not yet know what to do about. His eyes found Calvin in the back row. He looked Calvin up and down. He looked at Adelaide. He looked at the Buick parked outside the courthouse window. He looked at Calvin's wedding ring and at the buttons of Calvin's coat, and at the fact that Calvin's coat was 3 years older than it should have been. Frank Donovan leaned over to the thin man in the rimless glasses. He said something Calvin could not hear. The thin man wrote something in the portfolio. Frank Donovan turned back around. He did not raise his hand. He did not bid. He sat very still and watched the auctioneer hand a single brass key to a 74-year-old man he had never met before, and as he watched, his jaw set in a way that anyone who had known Frank Donovan for any amount of time would have recognized. Frank Donovan had been waiting 9 years for the house at 14 Prosper Street. This old man in the back row had just taken it from him for $12. And Frank Donovan was not a man who lost things and walked away. They drove to the house with the windows down. The Buick rolled slowly down Prosper Street, and Calvin watched the houses pass by, the way an engineer watches anything for the first time, taking the measure of it. The street was lined with old elms that had probably been planted when the houses were built. Most of the homes were small and well kept. Picket fences, painted shutters, a woman raking leaves in a yard, a man on a stepladder cleaning out a gutter, a boy on a bicycle that was too big for him. The street ended in a cul-de-sac, separated from its nearest neighbor by an empty lot overgrown with goldenrod and thistle. The Victorians sat at the dead end of Prosper Street, like a thing that had been forgotten by the rest of the block on purpose. Calvin stopped the Buick at the curb. He did not get out right away. He sat in the driver's seat with both hands still on the wheel, and he looked at the house the way a man looks at a problem he has been hired to solve. 3 stories of wood frame construction, a tower on the southeast corner with a peaked cap and a broken pane in the upper window, a wraparound porch with one corner collapsed where a support post had rotted through, paint peeled down to bare wood in long curling strips along the entire south face. The yard was more weed than grass. The walkway from the sidewalk to the front steps was buckled where tree roots had pushed up underneath it. "Calvin," Adelaide said. He did not answer. He was looking at the roofline. The pitch was steep, 8 inches of rise for every 12 inches of run, the kind of pitch a builder used in 1890 when builders still believed that snow needed somewhere to go. The framing under the shingles was the original framing. He could tell because the roofline had not deflected anywhere except in 3 small spots near the chimney, and those spots told him exactly where the leaks were and exactly how long they had been leaking. The roof had 3 soft spots. The foundation had not shifted. The exterior walls were plumb. He got out of the car. He walked up to the front of the property and stopped at the broken-up walkway. He put his right hand on the nearest porch column. He spread his fingers wide against the wood. He held it there for a long moment, not pressing, not testing, just feeling the column the way a doctor feels a patient's pulse. He could feel through his palm that the column was rotted at the base but solid above the rot. He could feel that the rot had not climbed. The column was salvageable, although not on its own. He would replace it. He did not say any of this to Adelaide. He did not need to. He looked up at the roofline. He looked down at the foundation stones visible through the gaps where the lattice had fallen away. He bent his knees slowly, the way a 74-year-old man bends his knees, and he ran his hand along the mortar between the foundation stones. The mortar was crumbling, but the stones were sound. He stood back up. "Addie," he said. She got out of the car. She walked up the buckled walkway to where he was standing. The wind moved her white hair. Her swollen hands held the front of her coat closed, even though the morning was not particularly cold. "The bones are good," Calvin said. "You can tell that from the porch." "I can tell that from the sidewalk." She looked at him. For the first time in 2 weeks, something in her face moved. It was not a smile. It was not even close to a smile. But it was a thing that lived in the same neighborhood as a smile, the way a porch light lives in the same neighborhood as the moon. "Show me," she said. The brass key fit the front door after some persuading. The lock had been rusted shut for years. Calvin worked it patiently, easing the key in and out until the mechanism remembered what it was for and turned. The door swung inward on hinges that groaned but held. The smell came first: dust, old wood, something faintly sweet that might have been dried flowers from 60 years ago, kept somewhere in the house in an envelope or a drawer that no one had opened. Underneath the dust, the smell of the house itself: oak, plaster, the pine of the original subflooring, the varnish on the staircase rail. The smell of a house that had been sealed against the world for a long time. Calvin stepped inside. The foyer was dark. He walked over to the nearest window and forced the shutter open. Sunlight fell across a hardwood floor buried under decades of dust. Long tracks of gray like the paths animals make in fresh snow. A staircase rose along the left wall. Solid oak. The banister still intact. The carved newel post at the bottom had a small chunk missing from its corner, where something had been knocked into it long ago. But the post itself was sound. Calvin walked through the foyer. Straight ahead was a parlor with a bay window. The curtains had rotted away decades ago, and the bay window let in a long fall of yellow afternoon light that lit up the dust in the air. To the right was a dining room with a stone fireplace. The mantel still held a row of small ceramic figures too dust-covered to identify. Calvin walked over and looked at them. He did not touch them. He could see under the dust the shape of a woman in a long dress, and the shape of a man in a Sunday hat, and the shape of a small dog. Whoever had set them on this mantel had set them carefully. They were spaced in a way that meant something to whoever had placed them there. Adelaide walked into the parlor. She walked slowly, her hand against the wall the way a person walks who is afraid the floor might not be where she expects it. She stopped near the bay window. She turned in a slow circle. She saw it before she really saw it. Sitting alone on the hardwood floor in the corner of the parlor with no piano anywhere near it was a piano bench. It was oak. Simple. Hinged lid. The cushion on the top was gone, the foam having long ago disintegrated, leaving only the bare wood. Around the four legs of the bench pressed into the floorboards were four circular dents about the size of silver dollars. The dents were dark, and they were old, and they were exactly the right distance apart to mark where the legs of a grand piano had stood for years, maybe decades. Adelaide stood very still. Then she walked across the room and sat down on the bench. She did not say anything for a long time. She lifted the lid. Inside the bench was empty except for a layer of fine dust and a single piece of yellowed cloth, folded neatly at the bottom. Adelaide reached in and touched the cloth. She did not pick it up. She just touched the corner of it with her fingertips. She closed the lid. She placed her hands flat on the wooden top of the bench. She spread her fingers wide, slowly feeling each joint resist. The right hand was worse. Her index and middle fingers bent to about 60 degrees before the pain stopped them. Her ring finger barely moved at all. The thumb was still strong, but even that had stiffened over the past year. She did not try to play the bench. She just sat there, with her hands resting on the place where her hands used to be able to do what hands do. Calvin came into the parlor. He stopped in the doorway. He saw his wife sitting on the bench in the late afternoon light, her white hair lit from behind her swollen hands flat on the oak. He saw her shoulders very slightly, very briefly drop a quarter of an inch. He did not go to her. He stood in the doorway and gave her the gift that men of his generation gave their women when their women needed to break a little. He gave her the gift of not being watched. He went down to the basement. He was gone for 15 minutes. When he came back, Adelaide was no longer on the bench. She was standing by the bay window looking out at the overgrown yard, her hands folded in front of her. Her face was composed. He told her what he had found in the basement: oak framing throughout, stone foundation, no visible cracks. 2 of the floor joists under the kitchen had some rot from an old water leak, but the rot was contained. He could replace those joists in a weekend. The main beam running the length of the house was sound. The mortar pointing on the foundation walls was bad, but mortar pointing was a job, not a disaster. The whole structure was overbuilt the way Victorians had been overbuilt, the way no one built houses anymore. Whoever built this house built it to stand for 200 years, Calvin said, and we got it for $12. We got it for $12. Calvin walked over to her at the bay window. He did not put his arm around her. He stood next to her and looked out at the same view she was looking at: the wild yard, and the dropped fence, and the dogwood that had grown crooked, because no one had pruned it in 50 years. Adelaide spoke without looking at him. "It's a real house, Calvin. It's a real house. I mean, it's not a ruin. Someone lived here. Someone cared about this place. Someone did. Someone will again." He did not say it as a promise. He said it the way he had said small structural truths for 42 years. He said it the way a man says the load is going to hold. That night they slept in the parlor on sleeping bags from the thrift store on Main Street. The thrift store was run by the Baptist church, and the woman behind the counter had charged them $6 for 2 sleeping bags and had thrown in 2 pillows for free. Calvin had also bought a battery lantern, a small 2-burner camp stove, and a case of bottled water at the hardware store across from the diner. The owner of the hardware store, a quiet man in his mid-50s named Daniel Mortensen, had looked at Calvin's $12 deed and shaken his head slowly. He had not said anything. He had opened a store credit account without being asked. "Pay when you can," Daniel Mortensen had said, "and come back when you need something. You will." Now Calvin lay on his sleeping bag in the parlor of the Bellinger house and listened to the dark. The house made noises, creaks, pops, a low groan that traveled through the walls when the wind shifted outside, a small thump from somewhere on the 2nd floor that might have been a bird in the broken tower window, or might have been nothing at all. "It's not ghosts," Calvin said into the dark. "I know it's not ghosts, Calvin. Wood contracts when the temperature drops at night. The exterior walls cool faster than the interior structure. You get differential stress across the framing. The house is just adjusting. I have been married to you for 51 years, Adelaide said. I know how houses breathe." He smiled in the dark, even now, even after everything. She could still do that. Adelaide could not sleep. The floor was hard, and her hip ached. She lay on her sleeping bag for almost 2 hours before she sat up. Calvin's breathing had gone slow and even. He was asleep. He had earned it. Adelaide got up quietly. She picked up the battery lantern. She turned the dial. The room went pale yellow. She walked through the house. She did not have a destination. She walked through the parlor, past the dining room into the kitchen, with its old porcelain sink, and its empty cabinets and its faded yellow wallpaper. She walked back into the foyer. She stood at the bottom of the staircase and looked up at the dark of the second floor. She did not go upstairs, not yet. She went back into the parlor. She walked to the corner of the room where the piano bench sat alone on the hardwood, and she sat down on it again, and she set the lantern on the floor beside her, and she opened the lid of the bench and looked inside it again, and the yellow cloth was still there, and the dust was still there, and nothing else was there. She closed the lid. She placed her hands on the wooden top of the bench in the position for a C major chord. Thumb on C, pinky on the G above. She tried to make her fingers reach. They could not reach. She had not been able to reach an octave in 5 years. She had stopped being able to play sometime before she had stopped being able to teach. She remembered the morning she had woken up and tried to play Chopin, and her fingers had simply not gone where she wanted them to go. She had not cried that morning either. She had stopped teaching. Her last student had been a 15-year-old boy named Lucas Nettleton, who had wanted to be a jazz pianist. She had told Lucas Nettleton that she was retiring. She had given him the names of 3 other piano teachers in the Columbus area. He had cried. She had not. She had gone through Sterling selling the house without crying. She had gone through Marigold's The Timing Isn't Good without crying. She had gone through Royce changing his number without crying. She had gone through realizing that her mother's wedding ring was missing from her jewelry box. And the only person who had been in her bedroom alone in the last 2 weeks was her oldest son. And she had gone through that without crying. But now in the parlor of a stranger's house with a lantern beside her on the floor and her hands flat on a piano bench. That did not have a piano. Adelaide Whitfield cried. She cried quietly. She cried the way a woman cries who has been holding it for 2 weeks and has finally found a small, dark place to set it down. She cried for the piano her son had sold for $75 to a second-hand shop on Route 9. She cried for her mother's ring. She cried for the version of her hands that had once played Chopin in the parlor on Linden Drive at 7 o'clock on summer evenings with the windows open. She cried finally for the version of her children she had thought she had raised, and for the version she had in fact raised, and for the gap between them, which was as wide and as deep as anything she had ever known. Calvin found her there at first light. He did not say anything. He had heard her get up. He had let her go. He had lain on his sleeping bag in the dark and listened to her walk through the house, and he had known where she had ended up, and he had known what she was doing there, and he had given her almost 3 hours. Now he came in and sat down next to her on the bench. He did not put his arm around her. He sat next to her, his shoulder almost but not quite touching her shoulder, and they watched the morning come through the bay window and fill the parlor with the first sunlight that room had seen in 60 years. Calvin, yeah, I am very tired. I know, Addie. I do not know if I can do this. He did not answer right away. He looked at the bay window. He looked at the dust in the air lit up by the morning sun drifting slowly. He looked at the floorboards, at the 4 small dents in the wood at the bench where his wife was sitting. "You don't have to do this today," he said. "Today, all you have to do is have a cup of coffee. There's a diner on Main Street. The woman who runs it told us first-timers eat free. That was yesterday. Then today we pay for it." He stood up. He held out his hand to her. After a moment, Adelaide took it. The morning of the second day, Calvin started on the porch. He had his list written on the back of the auction receipt in his small, careful handwriting. Priorities in order: porch supports, roof patches, window glass, exterior paint where the bare wood was exposed to weather. Each item on the list was in his engineer's shorthand, the kind of shorthand he had been writing on punch lists for 42 years. The porch was first because if it collapsed, they could not get in the front door. He pulled the rotted support post on the left side. He measured the gap with his tape twice the way he had been measuring everything twice since he had been a third-year engineering student at Ohio State in 1972. He drove to Mortensen Hardware. Daniel Mortensen was behind the counter drinking coffee from a chipped mug. "Calvin, Daniel, what do you need?" An 8-foot pressure-treated 4x4, a box of 3-inch galvanized deck screws, a tube of construction adhesive, and some shims, if you have them. Daniel Mortensen nodded. He walked back into the store. He came back 10 minutes later with everything Calvin had asked for, plus a small packet of cedar shims he had thrown in for free. Account. Anything else? Not today. Daniel Mortensen wrote the total in a paper ledger book, not a computer, not a tablet. A green hardback ledger with lined pages. He turned the ledger around and showed Calvin the running total. "You're at $38.14. I'll pay you. I know you will. Take your time." Calvin loaded the lumber into the trunk of the Buick. He drove back to 14 Prosper Street. He pulled up at the curb. He looked up at the porch. He took a long breath. He went to work. By mid-morning, he had the new post in place. He had shimmed it level and braced it with 2 angled supports. The left side of the porch, which had sagged for 30 years, did not sag anymore. He stood back on the sidewalk and looked at it. One post, straight and true. The rest of the porch still needed work. But that one post changed the whole line of the house. The entire roof of the porch had lifted by 2.5 inches, and the visual difference was the difference between a house that had given up and a house that was still in the fight. He stood on the sidewalk for a long minute and looked at his work. A young man came out of the house 4 doors down. Calvin had not noticed him before. The boy was about 17, tall and thin, dark blonde hair cut short. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and work boots that had seen real use. The kind of work boots a teenager only wears if he has been working since he was 13. The boy walked down his own front walk to the sidewalk, and then he walked up Prosper Street toward the Bellinger house, and then he stopped at the end of the front walk leading up to where Calvin was standing. The boy did not say anything for almost a full minute. He just stood there, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, watching Calvin measure the porch railing with the tape. Calvin let him stand. Calvin had raised a son once. Calvin knew that boys of 17 do not start with a sentence. They start with their hands in their pockets. Finally, the boy spoke. You need help with that." Calvin looked up. The boy's eyes were a steady gray-green. They were tired in a way that 17-year-old eyes should not be tired. The boy's jaw was set in a way that meant he was prepared to be told no. "Depends," Calvin said. "You know how to hold a level. I know which end goes up." Calvin considered the boy for a moment. "That's a start. Come up on the porch." The boy walked up the front walk. He climbed the new front steps. The new steps did not creak. Calvin had built them yesterday afternoon while Adelaide had been in town with Rose, and the steps were level and the steps were tight, and the steps would still be level and tight after both Calvin and the boy were dead. The boy stopped at the top of the steps and stood with his hands at his sides. "What's your name?" Tommy Brennan." "Calvin Whitfield." "Yes, sir." "I know who you are." Calvin tilted his head. "You do." "My grandmother lives at the Brennan house 4 doors down. She told me about the house, about the auction. The whole street has been talking about you since yesterday afternoon." "And what does the whole street say?" Tommy Brennan looked at Calvin steadily. "Mostly that you're crazy." Calvin almost laughed. He did not, but it was close. "What does your grandmother say?" Tommy Brennan looked at the porch column Calvin had just installed. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the angle of the support braces and at the way the whole left side of the porch had risen up where it had been sagging. He looked at the work the way a young man looks at work that has been done well by someone else. "My grandmother says you're a structural engineer," Tommy Brennan said. "She says the porch you're building is going to outlive everybody on this street." "What's wrong with your grandmother?" The boy did not flinch. He had been expecting the question. "Pulmonary fibrosis, end stage. She was on a list for a transplant for 2 years, but she got bumped off the list last winter when they decided she wasn't a candidate anymore. She's 78. She's on oxygen most of the day." "And your parents?" Tommy Brennan's jaw tightened. "My mother left when I was 4. My father died on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico when I was 9. I have lived with my grandmother in that house since I was 9 years old. I dropped out of school last year because I'm the only one who can drive her to her doctor's appointments, and I can't make it back to class on time." He said it flat. He said it the way a young man says a true thing he has said before to other adults who did not always know what to do with it. Calvin looked at the boy. "Tommy, come over here." The boy walked over. Calvin handed him a level. An old yellow Stanley level. The level Calvin had bought at Mortenson Hardware for $3 yesterday. The kind of level Calvin had owned for 40 years before he gave away his old one to a young engineer at his retirement party. "This level here, see that bubble in the glass tube? When the bubble sits dead center between the 2 lines, the surface is true. The world is straight. When the bubble's not centered, then something needs adjusting. The level doesn't lie. It's the most honest tool you'll ever hold." Tommy Brennan held the level in both hands. He held it the way a person holds a thing he has not been allowed to hold before. "Yes, sir." "Pays $15 an hour. I can use you 4 hours a day, 6 days a week for as long as it takes me to put this house back together. That's a job, Tommy. If you want it." Tommy Brennan held the yellow level in his hands and did not look up. "I want it, sir." "Then come back tomorrow morning at 7. Bring those work boots." Tommy Brennan nodded. He went home. Calvin watched him walk down the sidewalk to the Brennan house 4 doors down, and he watched Tommy Brennan disappear inside. Calvin stood on his new front steps and looked down the street at the small house where a 17-year-old boy was carrying a 78-year-old grandmother and a dead father and a missing mother, all by himself. And Calvin Whitfield felt something move inside his chest, the way the bubble had moved in the level 2 weeks ago, in his basement on Linden Drive. This time the bubble moved back towards center. That afternoon, while Calvin was still standing on his new front steps, a black Lincoln Navigator drove slowly past 14 Prosper Street. The Lincoln did not stop. It rolled past the house at maybe 10 miles an hour. The windows were tinted. From the curb, Calvin could not see who was inside, but the Lincoln slowed just slightly when it passed the front walk. And then it sped up again. And it turned at the end of the cul-de-sac and rolled past the house a second time slower this time, as if the driver wanted a second look. Calvin watched it pass. He memorized the license plate. 42 years of professional habit. He had been writing down license plates of trucks at job sites since 1985. He did not know why he wrote down this one. He just did. The Lincoln drove away. Inside the back seat of the Lincoln, Frank Donovan sat with his thin attorney and looked at the porch Calvin had just rebuilt. "He fixed the column," Frank Donovan said. The thin attorney, whose name was Sheldon Graves, looked at the porch over the top of his rimless glasses. "It's been less than 48 hours. He fixed the column, Sheldon." "I see that. That column has been broken since 2009. "I know." Frank Donovan tapped his fingers on the leather armrest. "Find out what he can afford. Find out what his wife's medical bills look like. Find out which of his children he's not speaking to and why. I want to know everything about that man by Monday morning." "Frank." "What?" "You said you were going to give it some time. You said you were going to wait for him to fail." Frank Donovan did not answer right away. He looked out the window of the Lincoln at the house where, 68 years ago, his grandmother Eunice had walked up the front steps with a Bible in her left hand and her resume in her right hand, and had been told no. Eunice Donovan had walked back down those steps and had cried in the cab of her husband's truck for an hour. Eunice Donovan had told that story at every family dinner for the next 47 years. Eunice Donovan had died in a 4-bedroom house 3 blocks from this one. In 2003, at the age of 75, looking out her parlor window at the silhouette of 14 Prosper Street, rising above the elms. Frank Donovan had been 23 years old when his grandmother died. He had been at her bedside. He had held her hand. She had asked him for one thing. He had promised. "Sheldon," Frank Donovan said quietly, "I waited 9 years already. I'm not waiting anymore. Find me a way." Calvin was up before dawn. He had the tools laid out on the 3rd-floor hallway by the time Adelaide came up the stairs with 2 mugs of coffee brewed on the small camp stove in the kitchen, a 22-ounce framing hammer, a cold chisel that had belonged to Calvin's father, a pry bar, a flashlight, a dust mask, and lying flat on the floor next to the rest of the tools, an old stethoscope that Calvin had bought at an estate sale in 1997 because he had thought he might find a use for it someday. and someday had finally arrived. Tommy Brennan came up the stairs at 7 o'clock sharp. He was wearing the same work boots and the same baseball cap as the day before. He had his grandmother's old wristwatch on his left wrist, a Timex from the 1980s with a cracked face. He had the yellow Stanley level Calvin had given him the day before tucked under his arm. He stopped at the top of the staircase. He looked at the wall at the end of the hallway. That's it. That's it. You're sure there's something behind there? Calvin walked over to the wall. He crouched down and ran his hand along the baseboard. This baseboard is pine. Every other baseboard in this house is oak. The wallpaper pattern is similar but not the same. The shade is half a step lighter. The repeat in the floral print is offset by half an inch. He stood up. He picked up the stethoscope. He pressed the bell flat against the plaster wool. He listened. He moved it 6 inches to the right and listened again. He moved it down a foot and listened. He took the stethoscope away from his ears. Listen. He held out the stethoscope to Tommy. Tommy hesitated. Then he took it. He fitted the earpieces in his ears the way Calvin had done, and he pressed the bell against the wall. The boy's eyes widened. There's air moving in there. There's a room in there. Adelaide stood in the hallway behind them, with both coffee mugs still in her hands. How long has it been there? Calvin took the stethoscope back from Tommy. 65 years, give or take. Whoever sealed this wall did it sometime after 1958. The wallpaper they used was a pattern that went out of production in 1962. How do you know that? I called the Historical Society in Columbus yesterday afternoon. Hannah Webb at the Brixton Library got me the number. The wallpaper is called Rosewood Garden. It was made by a company in Pennsylvania between 1949 and 1962. After 1962, they switched to vinyl-coated patterns and Rosewood Garden was discontinued. Adelaide looked at her husband. She had been married to him for 51 years. And there were still moments when she watched him work. And she remembered with a small, clean shock how much there was inside this man she lived with. Calvin. Yeah. Open it. He picked up the cold chisel. He placed the chisel against the seam where the false wall met the original framing of the hallway. He set the chisel at a slight angle the way his father had taught him to set a chisel in 1962 on a job site in Cleveland when Calvin was 12 years old. And his father was teaching him how to take down a section of bad plaster without damaging the framing behind it. He struck the chisel with the hammer. A chunk of white plaster fell to the floor in a small cloud of fine dust. He struck again and again and again. Each blow opened the wall a little more. The plaster came down in pieces. Behind the plaster was a layer of lath-thin wooden strips nailed horizontally to the framing. Calvin and Tommy worked together, Tommy holding a tarp under each section. As Calvin chiseled it loose, the dust rising into the hallway air and settling on their shoulders and on Adelaide's white hair as she watched from the top of the stairs. After 20 minutes, the wall was open. Behind the lath was a 4-inch gap. Behind the gap in the beam of Calvin's flashlight was a door. A door. Heavy oak. 6 panels. Darker than the rest of the woodwork in the house. A brass knob, tarnished nearly black. A brass keyhole. Calvin pulled the rest of the lath away. He stood back from the door and looked at it. There it is, Tommy said. His voice had gone soft. Calvin tried the knob. It turned, but the door did not move. He stepped back. He looked at the door frame. He looked above the door at the molding that ran along the top of the frame. He ran his hand along the top of the molding the way he had run his hand along things for 42 years to find what his eyes had not seen. His fingers brushed something small and metallic. He pulled it down. A key. Brass. Old. A simple notched blade. Clara Bellinger had sealed this room. She had nailed the door shut. She had plastered over it. She had hidden it behind a false wall, papered with a discontinued pattern. And she had left the key sitting on the molding above the door an inch above the frame, exactly where any person who ever opened the wall would find it without searching. She had not been able to enter, but she had not been able to lock it forever either. She wanted somebody to find this, Adelaide said quietly from the hallway. She did. Calvin fitted the key into the lock. It resisted for a moment. Then it turned with a click that echoed in the quiet hallway, the way old locks click when they have been waiting for a long time, and the wait is finally over. He pushed the door open. A rush of cool, dry air came through the doorway. The air carried a smell that was different from the rest of the house. Not dust and old wood, something closer to paper. Varnish. Dried flowers, the same faint, sweet smell from downstairs, but stronger here, denser. Calvin stepped inside first. Tommy followed him. Adelaide came in last and stopped just inside the doorway and put her hand on the frame to steady herself. The room was large, larger than it should have been. It ran the full width of the house on the east side. 2 tall windows looked out over the street. Both windows were intact. The glass was streaked with 60 years of grime, but the glass was unbroken. The morning light came through the dirty glass in pale golden bars that fell across the wood floor. In the center of the room, covered by a white cotton sheet that had yellowed almost to brown, was a shape they all recognized at the same time. A grand piano. Along the walls, on every flat surface, stacked on chairs and on the floor, and on a low bookshelf under the windows were piles of paper. Sheet music. Hundreds of pages, handwritten, ink on staff paper. Pages and pages and pages. Against the far wall stood a small writing desk, walnut, a single drawer, a slanted top. On the desk, placed precisely in the center, was a sealed envelope. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The room had the feeling of a place that had been waiting, not abandoned, waiting. This was Margaret's room, Adelaide said. She said it quietly. She said it the way a woman says the name of someone she has not met but already knows. Calvin walked to the desk. He picked up the envelope. The paper of the envelope was brittle. The flap had been sealed with old glue that had crystallized over the decades. On the front of the envelope, in careful handwriting that had faded to a light brown, were 4 words. To whoever finds this. He looked at Adelaide. She nodded. He opened the envelope carefully, sliding his thumb under the flap. The seal cracked. The paper inside was 2 pages, brittle but legible, written in the same careful brown ink as the front of the envelope. He read it aloud. Tommy stood with his back against the door frame. His arms crossed his head down. Adelaide stood by the piano with one hand resting on the yellowed sheet that covered it. And as Calvin read, her hand did not move from the sheet. My name is Clara Bellinger. I am writing this letter in February of 1959, 1 year after the death of my daughter Margaret Ann Bellinger, who was 19 years old. Margaret was a pianist. That is not enough to say. Margaret was music itself. She heard things in the silence the rest of us could not. She played her first recital at 8. She won the state competition at 12. By 15, she had been accepted to the Cincinnati Conservatory on full scholarship to begin when she turned 18. In the fall of 1955, when she was 16, Margaret was in an accident. A horse cart on the county road lost a wheel and struck her on the left side. Her left hand was badly injured. The doctors said she would regain most of the use, but the fine motor control, the speed and precision a concert pianist requires would not come back fully. Margaret did not stop. She did not complain. She sat at this piano the day she came home from the hospital with her left hand bandaged and swollen, and she began to compose. What she wrote was unlike anything I had ever heard. She composed music for hands that could not do what healthy hands could do. Wider fingerings, simplified chord voicings that still sounded full and rich. Pieces that a pianist with limited strength and reduced reach could play without pain and without the music suffering for it. She said she was writing for every pianist who had been told they could not play anymore. She composed for 3 years. Over 40 pieces for solo piano, several for piano and violin, a few for small ensembles, each one annotated in her own hand with notes about the adapted fingerings and the reasons behind each choice. Margaret died of pneumonia on March the 14th, 1958. She was 19 years old. It happened in 4 days. She was composing at this desk on a Monday, and she was gone by Friday. I have sealed this room because I cannot bear to enter it, but I cannot destroy what she created. It is all I have left of her, and it is all she left of herself. In the drawer of this desk, you will find a bank book. I have placed $800 in a trust account at the savings bank in town. It is Walter's insurance settlement, and every dollar I had. I have asked the bank that the account remain open until someone presents this bank book and this letter together. If the bank honors my request, the money may have grown by then. The funds are for 2 purposes only: the maintenance and restoration of this house and music education for those who need it most. If you are reading this letter, then someone has opened this room. I do not know who you are or how you found it, but I believe you were meant to find it. Please, let the music live. Clara Bellinger, February 1959. Calvin folded the letter. He placed it back on the desk. His hands were steady. His jaw was tight. Tommy had not moved from the doorframe. The boy was looking at the stacks of sheet music with an expression Calvin could not quite read. Adelaide was crying. She was not making a sound. The tears ran down her face, and she did not wipe them away. She was looking at the piano under its yellowed sheet. "Addie." She stepped forward. She took hold of the sheet with both hands, her swollen hands, and she pulled. The sheet slid off in one slow motion and pooled on the floor. The piano was a Steinway, a Model B, 7 feet long, ebony case. The finish was dull from 60 years of still air, but the wood was intact. No cracks, no warping. The room had been sealed tight enough that the temperature and the humidity had barely changed in 6 decades. Adelaide lifted the fallboard. The keys were yellowed ivory. The sharps were a dark brown. She pressed middle C with her index finger. The note came out slightly flat with a soft, muffled quality, but it came out. The hammer had struck the string. The string had vibrated. The soundboard had amplified the tone the way it had been built to do in 1947 in a factory in Queens, New York, by men who were paid to know what they were doing. "It needs tuning," Adelaide said, "but it works." She sat down on the bench, a real piano bench, this time with a cushioned top matching the piano. She adjusted her position the way she had adjusted her position 10,000 times at her own piano, the one Sterling had sold for $75 to a second-hand shop on Route 9. On the music stand above the keys, someone had left a composition open. The title was written in Margaret's handwriting at the top of the first page. "For Hands That Remember." Adelaide looked at the notation. She read through the first 8 bars. Her eyes moved across the staff lines. Her mouth opened slightly. "Calvin, what is it?" "The fingerings. Look at the fingerings." Calvin did not read music, but he could see what Adelaide was pointing at. Numbers above and below the notes written in pencil. The standard fingering notation pianists use to indicate which finger plays which key. These aren't normal fingerings. The intervals are wider. She's using the thumb and second finger where a standard arrangement would use the 4th and 5th. The chord voicings are spread differently. She designed these for someone with limited reach in the ring and pinky fingers. She placed her hands on the keys, her swollen knuckles, her stiff joints, the fingers that had not reached an octave in 5 years. She played the first chord. It sounded full, open, rich, and her fingers reached every note. She played the second chord, then the third, then the first phrase. The melody rose from the old piano, thin and slightly out of tune but clear. A melody that was warm and simple on the surface but built in complexity as it moved forward. And Adelaide's hands followed it, and her fingers found every note. Because Margaret Ann Bellinger had put every note exactly where damaged hands could find them. Adelaide played the first page. Then she turned to the second page and played that. Her eyes were wet, but her hands were steady. The music filled the sealed room and spilled out through the open door into the hallway and down the staircase and into the parlor below, where the bench with no piano sat in the corner, and the music kept rising. And Calvin stood with his back against the wall of the third-floor room and put both his hands flat on the plaster behind him, because if he did not have something solid behind him, he was going to lose his balance. Tommy Brennan was crying. The 17-year-old boy was standing at the doorframe with his baseball cap in his hand, and his shoulders shaking, and he was not making a sound. And Calvin saw him out of the corner of his eye and did not look at him directly, because Calvin Whitfield knew what it cost a young man to cry in front of a stranger, and he was not going to make it cost more. Adelaide played for 10 minutes. She played 3 of Margaret's compositions, sight-reading them from the yellowed pages. Each one was written for hands like hers, not simplified, not dumbed down. Full, complex, beautiful music arranged so that a pianist with arthritis or injury or age-stiffened joints could play it without pain and without compromise. When she finally stopped, the silence in the room was different from the silence that had been there before. Before, it had been the silence of a place that was sealed. Now it was the silence of a place that had been opened. Calvin sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. Tommy was sitting on the top step of the staircase just outside the door, his cap still in his hand. "How many pieces are there?" Adelaide asked, looking at the stacks of sheet music around the room. Tommy stood up. "Let me count." He moved carefully through the room, sorting the pages into groups. Each composition had a title page in Margaret's handwriting. He made a pile on the floor for each one. He worked in silence for almost 20 minutes. 43. 43 complete compositions. 31 for solo piano. 7 for piano and violin. 3 for piano and cello. 2 for small ensemble. It looks like piano, violin, cello, and flute. 43 pieces, Adelaide said, in 3 years. She was working fast, Calvin said. She knew she was running out of time. Calvin went to the writing desk and opened the drawer. Inside the drawer was a small leather-bound book with a brass clasp. The leather was cracked, but the clasp still held. He opened it. Bank book. Savings Bank of Brixton. Account opened February the 3rd, 1958. Single deposit, $800. That was everything Clara had, Adelaide said. The letter said Walter's insurance settlement. Calvin tipped the bank book flat in his palm. He looked at the entry. One line, written in bank teller script. $800 deposited February 3rd, 1958. Trust account with instructions that it remain open. 66 years, he said. That money's been sitting in a bank account for 66 years. If the bank is still there, Adelaide said. It's still there. Tommy spoke from the doorway. First National Bank of Brixton, Main Street. My grandmother has her account there. They looked at each other. The bank book. The letter. 43 compositions for players with damaged hands. A Steinway grand piano that still worked after 6 decades in a sealed room. The slow morning light coming through windows that had been waiting 60 years for somebody to open the curtains. Calvin could feel the bubble in his chest moving back towards center. He folded his arms and leaned against the desk. Clara said whoever found this room was meant to find it. Calvin, I don't believe in things like that. Neither do I. He did not say anything else for a moment. Then he said it. But a piano teacher with arthritis who can't play anymore just sat down in a dead girl's room and played her music for the first time in 60 years. And the music was written for exactly her hands. Adelaide looked at him. She looked at the piano, at the stacks of sheet music, at the letter on the desk, at the boy at the doorway who was no longer crying but who had not put his cap back on yet. I don't know what to call that. Me neither. He walked over to her and put his hand on her shoulder. But I'm not going to argue with it. That afternoon, while Adelaide was upstairs cataloging the sheet music with Tommy Calvin, put on the cleanest shirt he owned. It was a blue button-down, 20 years old, frayed slightly at the cuffs. He tucked it into a pair of slacks. He put on his good leather shoes. He combed what remained of his hair. He carried Clara's leather bank book in the inside pocket of his jacket against his chest. He walked to Main Street. The First National Bank of Brixton was a small brick building with green shutters and a brass plaque by the door that read, "Established 1897." A flag hung from a pole over the entrance. Calvin pushed the glass door open, and the old hinge groaned in a way that made the woman behind the counter look up. The woman was about 30, dark hair pulled back. Her name tag said, Diane. "Can I help you, sir? I'd like to inquire about an account." He placed the bank book on the counter. Diane opened it. She read the account number. She typed it into her computer. She read the screen. She typed the account number again, more carefully this time. She read the screen again. She looked up at Calvin. She looked back at the screen. She looked back up at Calvin. "Sir." "Yes." "This account was opened in 1958. "I know. It's a trust account. It's been earning interest for 66 years. "I know that too." "Is it still active?" Diane picked up the phone on her desk. "Mr. Harmon, could you come out here for a moment, please? I have something you should see." She set the phone down. She looked at Calvin with an expression he had seen before. It was the same expression the auctioneer had worn 10 days ago in the Cardwell County Courthouse. Not pity. Something closer to disbelief. "Our manager will be right out. You're going to want to sit down." Wendell Harmon was a man in his early 60s, gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses. He had been the manager of the First National Bank of Brixton for 22 years. And before that, he had been the assistant manager for 9 years. And before that, he had been a teller for 6 years. He had spent his entire adult life inside this brick building on Main Street. He knew most of his customers by their first names. He knew the names of most of their children. He led Calvin into his office in the back of the building. He closed the door. His office was small. A window that looked out on the parking lot. A framed photograph of his daughter at her college graduation in 2009. A framed photograph of his wife, who had died in 2018. He sat down across the desk from Calvin. "Mr. Whitfield, my name is Wendell Harmon. I have managed this bank for 22 years, and I have never seen anything quite like this." "Like what?" Wendell Harmon turned his computer monitor so that Calvin could see it. "Clara Bellinger opened this trust account on February the 3rd, 1958. She deposited $800 and left explicit instructions. The account was to remain open, earning interest until someone presented the bank book and the accompanying letter. She specified the letter. She used those exact words. 'To whoever finds this.' Yes. And the bank just left it. A trust with clear terms doesn't expire, Mr. Whitfield. The account moved from a basic savings instrument to a certificate of deposit in 1971, then into a conservative bond fund in 1989 when our parent holding company restructured. Each of those transitions followed the trust's original terms: safe, low risk, steady growth." He paused. "For 66 years, the funds have been compounding." Calvin looked at the number on the screen. He looked at it for a long time. He had to look at it twice because his eyes had not registered all the digits the first time. $127,000, Wendell Harmon said quietly, and 41 cents. Calvin sat back in his chair. He put his hand flat on the desk in front of him. He did not say anything for almost half a minute. Clara specified 2 purposes for the funds: maintenance and restoration of the property at 14 Prosper Street, and music education for those who need it most. Those are the only permitted uses under the trust terms. The funds cannot be withdrawn for personal use. They cannot be used to purchase other property. They cannot be transferred to a third party. She thought of everything. She had a good lawyer, Calvin said. She had a good lawyer or a very clear mind. Possibly both. Calvin looked at Wendell Harmon. How fast can I access funds for the restoration? Tomorrow morning. I can have the paperwork drawn up by close of business today. You bring the deed. I bring the trust documentation. We sign it together. The funds are released against approved invoices for materials and labor. Approved how? You bring me invoices. I sign them off. As long as they relate to maintenance, restoration, or qualifying educational use, the funds are released within 48 hours. Wendell. Yes, Mr. Whitfield. Thank you. You haven't even seen the worst part yet. Calvin frowned. What's the worst part? Wendell Harmon hesitated. He glanced at the closed door of his office. Then he looked back at Calvin. 3 months ago, Mr. Whitfield, a man came into this bank. He asked about this account. Who? Frank Donovan. He was very polite. He said he was conducting due diligence on a real estate matter and wanted to confirm that the trust was still active. I told him I could not give him any information about an account he was not a party to. He understood. He left. Calvin did not speak. Wendell Harmon leaned forward slightly. Mr. Whitfield, I have lived in this town all my life. I have known the Donovan family since I was a child. Frank's grandmother, Eunice, was the meanest woman I ever met. And she raised that boy after his parents died in a car accident on Route 9 in 1985, when Frank was 5 years old. The apple did not fall far from the tree. Frank Donovan has wanted that house for 9 years. He came to me 3 months ago and asked about this trust. He left very quickly when he realized he could not get information from me. He is going to come for that house, Mr. Whitfield. I do not know how, but he is going to come for it. Calvin sat in the chair across from Wendell Harmon and looked at him steadily. How do you know all this? Because I went to the auction 9 days ago, Mr. Whitfield. I sat in the back row. I watched Frank Donovan sit in the front row with his lawyer and his 2 assistants. I watched him plan to buy that house for $12. And I watched you raise your hand. Wendell Harmon paused. I came home that night and I told my wife's photograph that something good might finally be about to happen on Prosper Street. He stood up. He held out his hand across the desk. Calvin stood up and took it. Mr. Whitfield. Call me Calvin. Calvin, the First National Bank of Brixton is on your side. I want you to know that. Whatever Donovan is planning, you call me before you call your lawyer. Do you understand? I understand. Calvin walked out of the bank with the bank book in his jacket and Wendell Harmon's business card in his pocket and the certain knowledge that he had walked into a war he had not yet been told he was fighting. When Calvin got back to 14 Prosper Street, the black Lincoln Navigator was parked at the curb. A man in a dark gray suit was standing on the new front steps. He had his back to Calvin. He was looking up at the house. His hands were in the pockets of his suit pants. Calvin walked up the front walk. The man turned around when he heard Calvin's footsteps. He smiled. It was a polite smile. The kind of smile a man wears who has practiced it in mirrors. Mr. Whitfield. Frank Donovan. He held out his hand. Calvin did not take it. Frank Donovan did not seem surprised. He let his hand drop. "I'd like a word with you if you have a few minutes. About your house." Calvin stood at the bottom of the front steps. Adelaide had come out onto the porch behind Frank Donovan. She had a kitchen towel in one hand. She had been making lunch. Frank Donovan glanced back at her, then turned to face Calvin again. His smile did not change. "I think you and I have something to talk about, Mr. Whitfield. About this house. About the future of this property. I think we can help each other." Calvin looked up at him. "Mr. Donovan, I think you should come back another time." Frank Donovan tilted his head slightly. "When would be a good time, Mr. Whitfield?" "I'll let you know." Frank Donovan held Calvin's eyes for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded. "I'll be in touch, Mr. Whitfield." He walked down the front steps. He walked past Calvin without looking at him. He got into the back seat of the Lincoln Navigator. The Lincoln pulled away from the curb and rolled slowly down Prosper Street and turned the corner and was gone. Calvin stood at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at his wife on the porch. Adelaide was holding the kitchen towel very tightly. Calvin. Yeah. Who was that man? Calvin walked up the steps. He took her arm gently. "That was the man who's going to try to take the house from us." 3 days after that, Frank Donovan came back. He did not come alone. He came at 9 o'clock in the morning with a man named Sheldon Graves in the Lincoln Navigator. And he came with a real estate appraiser in a separate car. And he came with a man in a county jacket who said he was from the Cardwell County Department of Health and Safety. The county man had a clipboard. He stood on the new front steps and informed Calvin that the department had received an anonymous complaint about unsafe conditions at 14 Prosper Street. The department was required by law to investigate. Calvin stood in the doorway with his arms folded. "The property has been condemned for 33 years, he said. "I bought it 9 days ago at the county tax auction. I have a deed. The county sold it knowing it was condemned. There hasn't been time for any new conditions to develop safe or unsafe." The county man looked at his clipboard. "Sir, the complaint was specifically about the structural integrity of the porch and the framing of the second floor. The department needs to inspect. The department is welcome to inspect." Calvin stepped aside. The county man went inside. He was in the house for 25 minutes. He came back out. He looked at his clipboard. He looked at Frank Donovan, who was standing on the sidewalk by the Lincoln. He looked back at Calvin. "Sir, I am not finding any of the conditions described in the complaint. The porch is structurally sound. The framing is solid. I'm going to mark this as an unfounded complaint." Frank Donovan on the sidewalk did not change his expression. The county man left. Frank Donovan walked up to the porch. "Mr. Whitfield, could I have a moment of your time now?" "No." "Mr. Whitfield, I came here in good faith." "Mr. Donovan, you filed an anonymous complaint with the Department of Health and Safety in order to get a county inspector inside my house at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I would not call that good faith." Frank Donovan smiled. "You are an interesting man, Mr. Whitfield." "I am a tired man, Mr. Donovan. Please get off my porch." Frank Donovan walked back to the Lincoln. The Lincoln drove away. It rolled slowly down Prosper Street and turned the corner. Calvin watched it go. Then he went inside, and he picked up the phone, and he called Wendell Harmon, and he told him what had just happened. And Wendell Harmon said 3 words. It's already started. Over the next 2 weeks, the war moved underground. A second anonymous complaint arrived at the county fire marshal's office. An inspector came out and found nothing wrong. A third complaint went to the zoning board, alleging that Calvin was running an unlicensed commercial business out of a residential property. Adelaide had not yet taught a single lesson. Calvin called the zoning board and explained. The complaint was dismissed. Then the local newspaper ran a small story. The story was about a 66-year-old trust account at the First National Bank of Brixton that had recently been activated. The story did not name Calvin or Adelaide. The story raised questions about the legitimacy of the trust and quoted concerned community members who wondered whether such an old account could be legally honored. The story had no byline. The reporter was a freelancer from 2 counties over. Wendell Harmon read the story over coffee in his kitchen and called Calvin before he had finished his second cup. Frank's paying someone to write that. I figured. It's harassment, Calvin. It's harassment dressed up as journalism. I know what it is. What are you going to do about it? Calvin looked out the kitchen window at the porch he had rebuilt. I'm going to keep working. The next morning, Tommy Brennan came up the front walk with a flat tire on his bicycle. The bicycle was a 1990s Schwinn that Tommy used to get to the diner and to the hardware store and to his grandmother's pharmacy. The front tire had been slashed, not punctured. Slashed. A clean diagonal cut, about 3 inches long. Tommy set the bicycle on the porch. Mr. Whitfield. Tommy, I think we need to talk about that man. Calvin nodded. Come inside. Inside, Tommy told Calvin that the night before somebody had made a phone call to his grandmother's house. The voice on the other end had been male, muffled, and brief. The voice had said, "Tell your grandson to find a different job." Then the voice had hung up. Nell Brennan had taken the call. She had not told Tommy until that morning at breakfast. She was 78 years old, and she was on oxygen. And she had told Tommy with a steady voice and a hand that did not shake. But Tommy had seen the way she had not finished her toast. Calvin listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When Tommy finished, Calvin stood up. He walked to the front window. He looked out at Prosper Street. Tommy. Yes, sir. I need you to do something for me. Yes, sir. I need you to keep coming to work every day at 7 o'clock, the same as before. I need your grandmother to lock the doors at night, and I need you to call me at the first sign of anything else. But I do not want you to stop coming here. Because if you stop coming here, the man who slashed your tire wins. And we are not going to let him win. Do you understand? Tommy Brennan looked at Calvin. Yes, sir, Mr. Whitfield. I understand. Good. Now help me carry that bicycle to Mortenson's. We're getting you a new tire. That afternoon, Calvin drove the Buick to Columbus. He did not tell Adelaide where he was going. He told her he had business at the engineering board. He kissed her forehead and got into the Buick and drove 3 hours west on the same highway he had driven east on 16 days earlier, with everything he owned in the trunk. He drove to the Ohio Attorney General's office. He sat in a waiting room for 90 minutes. He read a magazine. He did not look at his phone. He waited. At 2:30 in the afternoon, an assistant attorney general named Marisol Greenwell took him into a small conference room. She was in her early 40s. Sharp eyes, notepad. She listened while Calvin told her about Frank Donovan and the anonymous complaints, and the slashed tire, and the threatening phone call to a 78-year-old woman with pulmonary fibrosis. She wrote 4 pages of notes. When he was finished, she set down her pen. "Mr. Whitfield, I want to be honest with you. The State Attorney General's office does not typically open investigations on a single citizen's complaint. We open investigations when there is a pattern. I understand, but you have brought me a pattern. Anonymous complaints to multiple county departments, all timed in coordination with a specific real estate dispute. A phone call to a vulnerable elderly woman. Vandalism of a minor's personal property. A newspaper story that appears to have been planted. If I can substantiate any of this independently, we have what we need to open a file." She looked at him. "And I have one more thing to tell you, Mr. Whitfield. Frank Donovan is not unknown to this office. He has been involved in the demolition of 6 historic properties in this state in the last 5 years. 3 of them were on the National Register of Historic Places. Each one was acquired through a process that on its face was legal, but that involved extensive coordinated pressure on the previous owners. We have a folder on him. Your situation might be the thing that lets us open it." Calvin sat back in his chair. He's done this before. He has done this for a living, Mr. Whitfield. Your house is not unique to him. Your situation is not unique to him. He is in his way very good at what he does. What can I do? Marisol Greenwell looked at her notes. Document everything. Save every voicemail. Save every letter. If anyone from the county shows up at your door, get their name and badge number. If anyone threatens you, write down the exact words within an hour of the threat. I'm going to give you my direct line. You call me, not the receptionist, when something happens. And it will happen. She handed him her business card. Calvin put it in his wallet next to Wendell Harmon's card. "Mr. Whitfield." "Yes." "How old is your wife?" 71. "And you?" 74. Marisol Greenwell looked at her notepad for a long moment. "Sir, I want you to understand something. Frank Donovan is counting on the fact that you and your wife do not have 18 months to fight him. He is counting on the fact that you will get tired. He is counting on the fact that 2 people in their 70s with no family support, with no local connections, will eventually crack. That is his strategy." "I know that," Calvin said. "How do you know?" "Because that's the strategy a man uses when he doesn't have a better one." He drove back to Brixton that evening. He stopped at Mortenson Hardware on his way home and bought 2 outdoor security cameras and a small floodlight and a deadbolt for the back door. Daniel Mortenson rang the items up without comment. He wrote the total in the green ledger. "Calvin." "Daniel. Need anything else?" "Not today." "You doing all right?" Calvin paused at the counter. "I'm doing what I have to do." Daniel Mortenson nodded. "Tell Adelaide we're thinking about you." "Who's we?" Daniel Mortenson looked at Calvin steadily. "Brixton, Calvin. Brixton is thinking about you." That night, Calvin sat in the parlor with the lights off. He had installed the cameras after dinner. He had installed the deadbolt. Adelaide had gone to bed at 10 o'clock. Calvin had sat down in the parlor with the bay window dark and the moon coming through the elms, and he had put his father's old shotgun across his knees, and he had stayed there. He was not going to use the shotgun. He was 74 years old. and he had not fired a weapon in 20 years, and he had no intention of firing one now. But he sat with the shotgun across his knees, the way a man sits with a thing that reminds him he is the one who keeps watch in his own house, the way his father had sat in the front room of a small house in Cleveland in 1963 when somebody had thrown a brick through their window, the way his grandfather had sat on the porch of a farmhouse in Indiana in 1934 when there had been talk of bandits on the county road. He sat in the dark of the parlor, and he did not sleep. Just before 2 in the morning, the floodlight Calvin had installed on the side of the house clicked on. The light was triggered by motion. Calvin stood up. He walked quietly to the side window of the parlor. He looked out. A figure was standing in the side yard. The figure was wearing dark clothing, a hooded sweatshirt. The hood was up. The figure was standing about 15 feet from the house, looking up at the second-story windows. The figure had something in its right hand. A spray paint can, maybe. Calvin could not tell at this distance. Calvin did not move. He watched. The figure stood in the floodlight for about 10 seconds. The figure had not expected the light. The figure had clearly been startled. The figure looked up at the floodlight, and then looked at the house, and then turned and then walked quickly, but not running back toward the street. Calvin watched the figure go. He memorized the height, the build, the way the figure walked. The figure was not Frank Donovan. It was younger, leaner, faster on its feet. One of the assistants, maybe, or someone hired. The figure disappeared past the empty lot next door. Calvin set the shotgun against the wall. He went into the kitchen and made himself a cup of instant coffee with hot water from the camp stove. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark and drank the coffee. He did not feel afraid. He felt instead the specific, clear focus of a man who has just identified the load-bearing point in a problem and now knows where to apply pressure. Frank Donovan was gonna keep coming. Calvin was gonna have to give him a reason to stop. He just had not figured out yet what that reason was gonna be. 3 days later, the world found out about Margaret Bellinger. Adelaide had called Hannah Webb at the Brixton Library to ask whether the library had archives of old issues of the Cardwell County Gazette. Hannah Webb had said yes and had pulled the relevant boxes from the basement. Adelaide had spent 2 afternoons in the small reading room of the library going through clippings from 1954 and 1955 and 1956 and 1957 and 1958. What she had found, Hannah Webb had photocopied for her without charge. A photograph of Margaret Ann Bellinger at 14, sitting at a concert grand piano on the stage of the Cincinnati Music Hall. Her hands on the keys, her chin slightly lifted, her eyes closed. A review from 1956 of a recital Margaret had given at the Cardwell County Fair, in which a critic had written that her playing of Schumann had reduced 2 grown men in the front row to tears. An obituary from March of 1958. 2.5 inches long. Margaret Ann Bellinger, aged 19. Pneumonia. Survived by her mother, and 1 more clipping. From November of 1957. A photograph of Margaret at her piano. But this photograph was different. In this photograph, she was 16. Her left hand was wrapped in a thick white bandage. She was sitting at the Steinway in her own home on the 3rd floor of 14 Prosper Street. and she was looking down at a sheet of staff paper on which she was writing a composition with her right hand. The caption read, "Local pianist injured in accident composes music for injured pianists." Adelaide had stared at that photograph for almost an hour. She had brought it home along with the rest of the clippings, and she had laid them out on the dining room table, and she had called the closest person she knew with academic credentials in music. Dr. Ruth Ashford was 64 years old. She was a professor of music education at Ohio State University. She had taught Adelaide's son Royce in a music appreciation course in 2002. Although she did not remember Royce and Adelaide did not bring him up, Adelaide had read 3 of Dr. Ashford's articles in the Journal of Music Education over the years. She had once heard Dr. Ashford give a lecture in Columbus on adaptive piano pedagogy. Dr. Ashford listened to Adelaide's phone call for 15 minutes. Then she said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I will be there tomorrow morning." She drove from Columbus on a Saturday. She arrived at 14 Prosper Street at 10 minutes past 9. She wore cotton archival gloves. She brought a portable scanner and 4 boxes of acid-free folders and a notebook the size of a Bible. She spent the entire day in Margaret's room. She did not eat lunch. Adelaide brought her tea at 1 in the afternoon, and Dr. Ashford took it without looking up. She photographed every page of every composition. She read Clara's letter 3 times. She sat at the Steinway briefly and tried to play the first 8 bars of For Hands That Remember, and she stopped after the 4th bar because she was crying. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she came downstairs. She sat in the parlor across from Calvin and Adelaide. She accepted a cup of coffee from Rose Hartwell, who had appeared sometime during the afternoon with a casserole, and had stayed without being asked. Dr. Ashford set her cup down. "I have spent my career studying adaptive music pedagogy. The field as a formal discipline did not exist before the early 1970s. There are in the academic literature perhaps a dozen significant early works in the area of music composition for pianists with physical limitations. The earliest of those is from 1973. She paused. What Margaret Bellinger wrote in this house between 1955 and 1958 predates all of them. She did not just compose music. She invented a methodology, a complete pedagogical system for teaching piano to pianists whose hands cannot do what textbook hands can do. She did this when she was 16. She did this with one bandaged left hand." Adelaide put her hand over her mouth. "With your permission," Dr. Ashford continued, "I would like to bring 2 colleagues from the Cincinnati Conservatory to evaluate the collection for possible publication. I would like to nominate Margaret's compositions for inclusion in the National Archive of American Music. And I would like, if you are willing, to begin the process of registering this house as a protected historical landmark." Adelaide looked at Calvin. Calvin looked at Adelaide. Calvin spoke first. "Dr. Ashford, there is a man who is trying to take this house from us. He has been trying for 9 years. He has filed false complaints with the county. He has sent someone to vandalize our property. He has threatened a 78-year-old woman with lung disease. We have an attorney general open file on him. But we do not at this moment have any way to stop him from buying his way into this property if he decides to push hard enough." Dr. Ashford listened. "You are telling me there is a hostile party trying to acquire the house?" "Yes." "And he has resources?" "Yes." Dr. Ashford did not blink. "Mr. Whitfield, There is an emergency designation process in the National Historic Preservation Act designed for properties facing imminent threat of destruction. If we file by Monday morning with sufficient documentation, the Register can issue a temporary protected status within 14 days. Once that status is in place, no party, public or private, can acquire this property for the purpose of demolition or substantial modification. A hostile buyer becomes legally irrelevant. She paused. I have written 3 of those emergency filings in my career. None of them were as well documented as what is sitting in your 3rd-floor room, sir. With Margaret's letter, with Clara's trust, with the articles from the Gazette, with my own academic certification, this property has every element required for emergency historical protection. Calvin and Adelaide sat very still. Rose Hartwell, in the corner of the parlor, set down her coffee cup. "How fast can you file?" Calvin said. "By Monday morning. I will work all weekend. What do you need from us?" "Your signatures on the application as the property owners, access to the documents for 1 more day so I can prepare scans. And if you are willing, a letter from Mrs. Whitfield describing her experience with Margaret's compositions as a pianist with arthritis. That kind of personal testimony from a working musician adds significant weight to the application." "You will have all of it." Dr. Ashford nodded. She gathered her things. At the door she stopped and she turned around. "Mrs. Whitfield?" "Yes. I have read every page in that room twice today. I want you to understand. What Margaret left is not a curiosity. It is not a footnote. It is the foundational text of a discipline that grew up after she was already buried. We are going to publish this. We are going to teach it. We are going to make sure that every pianist with arthritis or with injury or with age-stiffened hands knows her name and plays her music. That is what she asked Clara for. That is what Clara asked you for. And we are going to do it." She left. Adelaide sat down on the couch. She did not cry. She had cried enough. She put her hand on Calvin's knee, and she said very quietly, "Calvin, yeah, we are going to win this fight. I know we are. Tell me how." "By doing the next thing, and the next thing after that. Same way I built the porch. Same way I built every bridge I ever built. Same way you taught every student you ever taught. One straight line at a time, until the whole structure stands." She closed her eyes. She nodded. "One straight line at a time," she said. It started with a knock on the door on a Tuesday afternoon. The day was gray, the kind of November day where the light never really comes up, and the wind moves through the elms with a sound that is half whistle and half complaint. Adelaide was in the parlor, sorting through the printed copies of Margaret's compositions that Dr. Ashford had returned to her after her 2nd visit. Calvin was on the 2nd-floor landing fitting a new windowsill. The knock was firm. 3 quick raps. Adelaide answered the door. A woman stood on the porch with a girl of about 11 beside her. The woman was about 35 years old. Brown hair pulled back, tired eyes, a heavy canvas coat that had probably been her husband's. The girl was small for her age, with red blonde hair in 2 braids, and she was holding her right hand inside her left, the way a person holds a wounded animal. "Are you the piano teacher?" the woman said. Adelaide had not expected the question. "I used to be." My name is Caroline Pierce. This is my daughter, Sarah. We heard about the music, about the lady who teaches piano in the Bellinger house, about the music that's written for hands that can't do things." She paused. "My daughter wants to learn to play. 2 teachers in the county have already turned her down. They told her she would never play properly." Sarah Pierce looked up at Adelaide. She slowly lifted her right hand. Her third and fourth fingers were stiff and curled inward. A long, smooth scar ran across the back of her hand from the knuckle of her ring finger to her wrist. "Farm accident," Caroline Pierce said. "Last summer. The doctors did what they could. The fingers don't bend right anymore. The teachers said they couldn't work with her. But we heard about you, and we drove 22 miles to come knock on your door." Adelaide knelt down slowly. It was not easy for her to kneel anymore. Her hip protested. Her right knee made a soft popping sound. But she went down on one knee in the doorway of the Bellinger house, and she looked Sarah Pierce in the eye at her own height. "Sarah." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you want to play piano?" Sarah Pierce nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you are going to play piano. Come inside." 20 minutes later, Sarah Pierce was sitting at the upright piano that Pastor Theodore Whitley's congregation had donated from the storage room of the Baptist church. The piano was old, but tuned. Adelaide had placed a beginner exercise from Margaret's collection on the music stand. The exercise was titled First Steps and was designed for a pianist with reduced reach in the right hand. Adelaide showed Sarah where to put her left hand. She showed Sarah where to put her right hand. She showed Sarah the adapted fingering the way Margaret had drawn it out for fingers that did not bend the standard way. Sarah Pierce played the first phrase. She played it slowly. She played it carefully. She played every note. She looked up at Adelaide, and for the first time since she had walked into the house, Sarah Pierce smiled. Caroline Pierce was crying in the doorway. Tommy Brennan, who had been working on the railing outside, had come in without anyone noticing and was standing in the foyer with his cap in his hand. Calvin was at the top of the staircase, unable to come down, because he could not trust his knees on the steps with what he was feeling in his chest. Adelaide put her hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Sarah." "Yes, ma'am." "You are going to be a piano player." By the second week, Adelaide had 3 students. Sarah Pierce came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. A retired farmer named Earl Caldwell, 68 years old with hands gnarled by rheumatoid arthritis, came on Mondays. A former school secretary named Helen Maddox, 63, with nerve damage in her left hand from a fall, came on Wednesdays. By the 3rd week, there were 5 students. By the 4th, there were 8. Word of the piano lessons in the Bellinger house traveled the way news travels in a town of 2,000 people. From Rose's diner to the post office to the barber shop to the church potluck on Sunday afternoon. By Thanksgiving, 3 families from outside Brixton had called to ask whether Adelaide would take their children. Adelaide said yes to all of them. She charged what she could afford to charge. For some students, that was $20 a lesson. For others, it was nothing. For Sarah Pierce, it was nothing forever. Because Adelaide had decided on Sarah's first day that this girl was going to play in a real recital before she was 12. And Adelaide was not going to let $20 a week stand between Sarah Pierce and a life with music in it. The trust paid for everything. Wendell Harmon signed off on the invoices for tuning for sheet music. For a second piano, Calvin and Tommy moved into the dining room so that two students could practice at the same time. The trust covered Adelaide's small honorarium when the load got heavy. The trust covered Tommy's wages. The trust covered also a particular thing Calvin had been working on quietly for some time. And then, on the second Tuesday of January, the National Register of Historic Places issued the Emergency Protection Order. A federal letter arrived at 14 Prosper Street in a thick cream envelope on a Tuesday morning. Adelaide opened it on the porch. She read it twice. She walked back into the kitchen with the letter in her hand. Calvin. He looked up from his coffee. She held the letter out. He read it. He set it down on the kitchen table. He stood up. He walked over to his wife and he put both his hands on her shoulders and he looked her in the eyes for a long moment. Addie. Yes. We won. The next day, Frank Donovan came back. He came in the Lincoln Navigator with Sheldon Graves and a uniformed deputy from the Cardwell County Sheriff's Office. Frank Donovan walked up the front steps with a thick folder under his arm. He rang the doorbell. Calvin opened the door. Mr. Whitfield, I am here to deliver a temporary restraining order signed this morning by a judge of my acquaintance in the next county over. The order halts your residential music education activities pending review of zoning compliance. Please have your wife discontinue all lessons immediately. He smiled. Or if you prefer, we can have a different conversation. $275,000 cash today. I withdraw the restraining order. You and your wife can move anywhere you like. Calvin did not respond. Behind Frank Donovan, on the front walk, the front door of the Lincoln opened, and Dr. Ruth Ashford got out. She had been waiting in the car since 6 in the morning. She walked up the porch with a folder of her own. Mr. Donovan, Sheldon, Mr. Whitfield. Frank Donovan turned around. His smile faltered. Dr. Ashford. This property, Dr. Ashford said calmly, was added to the National Register of Historic Places under emergency designation at 8:47 this morning, 13 minutes before you arrived at this door. Your restraining order, which targets the operation of a historically protected educational program, is unenforceable as of the moment the federal designation was published. Frank Donovan's face did not move. Sheldon Graves's mouth opened and closed. Dr. Ashford continued unhurried. In addition, sir, my colleague Marisol Greenwell at the Ohio Attorney General's office finalized her investigation file on you yesterday afternoon. The file describes a 5-year pattern of coordinated harassment of property owners across 6 counties in this state. Mrs. Greenwell is filing a civil action against you, your firm, and Mr. Graves personally on Friday. She paused. Wendell Harmon at the First National Bank of Brixton has provided sworn testimony that you attempted to obtain confidential information about the Bellinger Trust 3 months before the auction. Patricia Holloway from the Cardwell County Auctioneer's Office has provided sworn testimony about your previous attempts to acquire this property. Daniel Mortensen at Mortensen Hardware has provided sworn testimony about an individual matching the description of one of your assistants attempting to purchase materials consistent with the vandalism that occurred at this address 3 weeks ago. Frank Donovan stood on the porch and said nothing. Mr. Donovan, Dr. Ashford said you are not going to win this. You are not going to win this today. You are not going to win it tomorrow. You are not going to win it ever. I would very strongly suggest that you turn around, get into your car, and never come back to this street again. Sheldon Graves put his hand on Frank Donovan's arm. Frank. Frank Donovan did not move for almost 10 seconds. Then he looked at Calvin. Calvin had been silent the entire time. Calvin looked back at him steadily. And then Calvin did something Frank Donovan had not expected. Calvin stepped out onto the porch, and he walked slowly until he was standing within arm's reach of Frank Donovan. And he did not raise his voice. "Mr. Donovan." "Yes." "Your grandmother, Eunice Donovan. I read about her at the library. She had a 47-year career as a piano teacher in St. Louis. Hundreds of students. She was a serious musician, sir. She did good work." Frank Donovan's jaw tightened. Clara Bellinger turned her away in 1956. Not because your grandmother was not a fine pianist. Clara Bellinger turned her away because Clara Bellinger was burying her daughter. There could not be another musician in this house. It was not about your grandmother, Mr. Donovan. It was about a mother who had lost everything. He paused. Your grandmother deserved that explanation. I'm sorry she never got it. Frank Donovan stood very still. He looked at Calvin for a long time. Then he turned and he walked down the porch steps, and at the bottom of the steps, he stopped. And without turning around, he said very quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield." He got into the Lincoln Navigator. Sheldon Graves followed him. The Lincoln pulled away from the curb and drove down Prosper Street and turned the corner. Calvin stood on the porch for a long time after it was gone. Adelaide came out and stood beside him. She did not speak. She put her hand on his arm. The wind moved through the elms. A week later, Sterling came back. He came in his Audi alone. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans and work boots. No suit, no tie. No assistant in the passenger seat with a leather portfolio. He pulled into the curb and got out and stood at the end of the front walk for almost a full minute before he could make himself walk up. Calvin was on the front porch fixing the railing. He saw Sterling come up the walk. He set down his hammer. Sterling stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Dad," Calvin nodded. "I came to help. With anything that needs doing. I do not have any right to ask for forgiveness. I'm not asking. I want to work." Calvin looked at his son for a long moment. Sterling's eyes were red. He had not slept well in some time. The flannel shirt was old. The work boots were new and stiff and cheap. He had clearly bought them yesterday from a Tractor Supply in Cleveland. "Sterling." "Yes. Tomorrow at 6. Bring those boots. Don't bring anything else." For 3 days, Calvin worked Sterling like Calvin had worked Tommy. Not harder. The same. Sterling stripped paint from the back of the house with an oscillating tool. He laid bricks for a new walkway. He sanded the window sills on the second floor. He climbed a ladder higher than he had ever climbed in his life, and he sweated through his flannel. And he did not complain, and he did not look at his phone. On the evening of the 3rd day, Sterling came to the kitchen with his hands torn up and a small jewelry box in his coat pocket. He set the box on the table. Adelaide opened it. Inside, on a small bed of cotton, was her mother's wedding ring. Sterling did not sit down. "I went to the pawn shop on Meridian Street 3 times. The first 2 times the owner refused to sell it back. The 3rd time I offered him $2,000. He kept it in the bottom drawer the whole time. He told me he had a feeling about the way I sold it to him. He kept it for someone. Adelaide picked up the ring. She slid it onto her swollen finger. It fit. She did not cry. She said, "Thank you, Sterling." Sterling looked at his father. "Dad, I know I do not deserve to be called your son anymore, but I would like to learn how to be one again. The way you do things. The way you are." Calvin set down his coffee. "Next weekend you come back. Bring better gloves. I have a lot to teach you." That was all that was said. It was enough. 3 weeks later, Royce called from Boston. He was 42 years old, and he had not spoken to his mother in 11 months. He worked at a tech company in the seaport. He had read about the house in a magazine article that had gone online the week before. He had not slept in 2 nights. He called Adelaide at 7 in the evening from his apartment. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. He came on a Saturday. He worked alongside Sterling. Marigold did not come. She called Adelaide the following week and apologized in a way that was incomplete but real. And she asked whether she could send her 2 children to spend a week in the summer at the Bellinger house. Adelaide said yes. That was something. It was not everything, but it was something. In April, Tommy Brennan finished the last railing on the wraparound porch. Calvin handed him an envelope. Inside were 3 things: a letter of acceptance from Cardwell County Adult Education for the GED program beginning the following month, a scholarship award from the Bellinger Whitfield Memorial Fund, which had been set up the previous winter, through the trust in the amount of $40,000 over 4 years, and a letter of recommendation from Calvin Whitfield, professional engineer, Ohio, license number 044412, 2 pages long, single-spaced. The recommendation was for the structural engineering program at Ohio State University. Tommy read all 3 documents. He sat down on the front step with his head between his knees. Calvin sat down next to him. He put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The recital was held on the first Saturday in May. 40 folding chairs were set up in the parlor. 10 more people stood along the walls. Eleanor Brennan sat in the front row with her oxygen tank beside her. Rose Hartwell sat with her. Sterling stood at the back of the room next to Royce, the 2 of them shoulder to shoulder for the first time in more than a decade. Dr. Ruth Ashford had come down from Columbus with 2 colleagues from Cincinnati. Hannah Webb had come from the library with a framed copy of the 1957 photograph from the Cardwell County Gazette. The photograph of Margaret at her piano with her left hand in the bandage. Mason Hardy played first. He was 9 years old, autistic, and had not spoken a complete sentence to a stranger in 2 years. He played Margaret's beginner piece, Morning Walk. When he was finished, he stood up, walked to the small microphone Calvin had set up at the front of the room, and said very clearly, "Thank you to my mother." His mother put her hands over her face and wept. Earl Caldwell played Margaret's What the Hands Remember with his rheumatoid hands. Helen Maddox played a slower piece that fit her nerve damage. Sarah Pierce played for Hands That Remember. The room was quiet when she finished. Not polite quiet, the other kind. And then Adelaide played. She played Margaret's longest composition, the one Margaret had been writing in the days before she died, the one whose title was on the first page in Margaret's handwriting letter to someone I haven't met. Adelaide played it from memory. Her swollen hands moved across the keys with a certainty that had nothing to do with strength, and everything to do with understanding. The melody rose from the old Steinway and filled the parlor, and went up the staircase and through the open door of Margaret's room on the third floor. And the late afternoon sun came in through the clean windows, and the house breathed for the first time in 66 years. When she finished, Eleanor Brennan was the first to clap, slowly, weakly, with determination. The room followed her. Outside on the sidewalk, 3 people walking past had stopped to listen. Later, when most of the guests had gone, Calvin walked upstairs to the third floor. He sat down at the writing desk in Margaret's room. He opened the drawer. Inside, beside the leather bank book, was the small white envelope Sterling had sent anonymously weeks ago before Sterling had come back. The check inside was for $80,000. Calvin had never told Adelaide. He had never deposited it. He took the check out. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he tore it. Twice. 4 pieces. 8. 16. He carried the pieces to the small brick fireplace in the corner of the room. He placed them on the cold ash. He took a wooden match from the box on the mantel. He struck the match. He lit the pieces. They burned in less than 30 seconds. Sterling did not need to pay his way back. He had paid with his hands. He had paid with 3 days of stripping paint and laying brick and sanding sills. He had paid with a $2,000 drive to a pawn shop on Meridian Street. That was the price. Calvin closed the bench. He walked downstairs. That night, when the last guest had left and the dishes were drying on the rack, and Sterling and Royce were sitting on the back porch with 2 beers between them, talking about nothing, Adelaide went up to the third floor and opened the window. The night was warm. Early May. The smell of magnolia from somewhere down the block. She sat at the Steinway. She played a short piece by Margaret, 3 minutes long. Tommy Brennan, 4 houses down, sat on the steps of his grandmother's house and listened. Rose Hartwell, locking up the diner, stopped on the sidewalk with her keys in her hand. A woman 2 doors down came out onto her porch. A man across the street stopped on his way to the mailbox. A young couple walking their dog paused in the middle of the sidewalk. By the time Adelaide finished, 9 people were standing in the yard. They did not clap. They stood in the silence after the music, the way people stand in church after a benediction. A boy of about 12, who lived in the next block, ran up to his father on the sidewalk and tugged his sleeve. "Dad, you said this was the haunted house." His father, a man of about 40, put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "I was wrong, son. It was never haunted. It was just waiting." Calvin stood on his porch with a cup of black coffee in his hand and watched them. He thought about a basement workbench he had built in 1985. He thought about a magnolia tree he had planted in 1983. He thought about a house at 14 Prosper Street that had been waiting 66 years for the right people to find it. It was just a house. A real house with good bones, an open door, and music coming through the windows. The music had never stopped. It had only been waiting for the right hands to find it.